Hello, welcome to another Parallel Project Training podcast. I'm Ruth Phillips and I'm here today with Paul Neighbour, and we're going to be talking about procurement linked to the APM PMQ syllabus for exams starting in September 2024. Welcome to the podcast, Paul.
Hello, how are you today?
I'm good. I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts about procurement. So let's have a look at the syllabus, and then we can start having a discussion about different aspects of procurement. The syllabus says that we need to understand procurement as securing the provision of resources, choosing strategies for obtaining best value from supply chains.
It's quite interesting, that, isn't it? Securing and provisioning resources.
Yes.
That could imply all resources, couldn't it? So it could be human resources, material resources. It's about getting best value, isn't it?
Absolutely.
The supply chain.
And the importance of negotiation then to secure that best value.
Yeah. It's buying stuff, isn't it? Buying services and stuff that you need resources to do the project.
Because we're not going to be able to deliver all of that in-house.
I think I could have said this better. I think I said understand the procurement to secure the provision of external resources.
So we've got a number of different learning objectives for this. The first one is that we need to understand the purpose and importance of a procurement strategy. What's the procurement strategy and why is it so important for us on our project?
A lot of places won't actually have a procurement strategy as a document. It's like a lot of things in project management. People think because it's not written down, it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
But actually, other places might call a procurement plan, or you might have just thought about, well, how am I going to buy this goods or services that I need? The purpose of it is to make sure that we take effective procurement decisions. So that could be, I'm just getting a new bathroom fitted. So I got 3 quotes in from 3 different suppliers, and I'm choosing not only just the best value, but someone who seems competent. So it's not just pricey. It's about getting the right resources in to deliver the project.
So you mentioned that some organisations might not have that formally documented.
Yeah.
Is that a problem? Should we be aiming for formal documentation?
No, not in my opinion. So a lot of processes that we have, we don't write them down. That's just the way we do them. I think most organisations will have a procurement plan or procurement approach. They just might not have written it down. The purpose is to, first of all, get value for money. Second, some organisations are regulated like public sector bodies, where they're spending public money. And so they have regulations and rules that they have to follow. So it's worthwhile having a procurement plan or procurement strategy to make sure you follow those.
And as with many areas, the importance is that our project is aligned with what the organisation does in terms of procurement, that we don't go off into left field doing something different.
Yeah, and procurement is one of those usually highly regulated parts of organisations. You know, in a large organisation, have a procurement department, and that comes on to the second part, is really to define the roles and responsibilities for procurement. So who can issue orders, who can issue contracts,
Absolutely.
who can approve invoices. And there's a clear principle of like division of responsibility where you usually have at least 3 people in the loop to prevent corruption. I think those are the 3 things: getting best value for money, complying with any regulations, and being really clear on who's doing what the delegated responsibilities are. And those are the benefits of a procurement plan.
If I were going to create one and document one, what would the typical contents of that be?
Oh, that's a really good question. On a larger project, this could be a big document. On a small project, it might just be a section in project management plan. But typically, you would start off by thinking about what we're going to do in-house and what we're going to buy. So they call them make-buy decisions. If we take the work breakdown structure, for instance, which work packages should we do ourselves or should we recruit people to do? Which packages should we buy in? So that's the first thing, understand what we're going to go to the market to buy. And then the next thing is, how should we break those packages down? Should we just go to one supplier to do them all? So go to what I call a prime or principal contract. I think APM call a prime or a single contract. Or do I need to break it down into a number of separate suppliers who can work in parallel on the work? So I could have an electrician, I could have a plumber, I could have a carpenter separately, or I could go to a bathroom company to do the whole thing and they would charge me lots of money to do that. But I've only got that single point of contact. We could break the project into phases. So I could get an architect to do one bit or bathroom designer to do one bit, and then I could take the drawings and I could get all the different trades to do the second part, the installation part.
Yeah.
So what am I going to buy in? How am I going to break what I'm going to buy in into different contract packages?
Yeah.
And that needs to reflect your work breakdown structure, really.
Yeah.
So if you've got one big work package, that'll be in your work breakdown structure. If you're going to break it into different suppliers, they each need a work package.
When we're making these kind of decisions, it's all about risk, convenience, cost of doing that.
I actually think it's all about risk, Ruth. It is just about risk. If I've got some risk and I can give it to somebody who's better able to manage that risk than I am, then that reduces the cost. It's just about taking the risk within the project and giving it to the supplier. If we're better to manage the risk in-house, then we should manage it in-house. If there's someone who's an expert in something, then we should give them the risk to manage.
There's also that positive risk in terms of innovation and things like that. If you're handing this over to somebody that this is their bread and butter, this is what they're always doing, they're probably able to innovate, think about more efficient ways of doing it because they've got that experience, whereas it could be in-house. This is the first only time that we're going to do something like that.
So think about a website. I could probably write a website for Parallel, but one, it would take me forever.
Yeah.
And two, it wouldn't be very good. So it would be more expensive and the risk would be higher, but we can find an expert who basically that's their job. That's what they do every day. Contracting that work out to that web developer is a really good decision in terms of procurement. Procurement strategy is all about thinking where to place the risks on the project. Who's the best person to manage the risk?
That's a really good way of looking at it.
APM talk about a couple of other things here. They talk about whether we're doing a transactional or collaborative arrangement for those contracts.
What's the difference between those?
I always think of Amazon as very transactional. It doesn't mean it's poor quality or cheap or not good service, but you're just buying a standard service.
Yeah,
off the
it's
shelf.
more off the shelf, yeah.
So bricks, sand, concrete, computers, you can just buy them off the shelf. You still might have vast quantities, but you're buying to a fixed specification for a fixed price is fairly well defined. Collaborative, I think of architects, web developer or software developer or coder. It's
doing something much more bespoke.
They're bringing more of their own intellectual, yes, it's more bespoke, and they're bringing ideas to the party. And so we're working in a cooperative way. We've got to the point where we decided what contracts we needed. We've decided whether we're going to have a contractual. There's a couple of other things we need to decide too before we get there.
Strategy.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the first thing is what form of contract we're going to use. So there are standard sets of contract that you can use, and commonly used ones are what they call the NEC suite of contracts. Okay. So they're the new engineering form of contracts. They've got different types, A, B, C, D, E, and F, I think. But they're just like a set of legal terms and conditions that underpin the contract and duties of the customer and supplier. And there's another set of contracts called the JTC, Joint Contracts Tribunal. So these are standard contracts written by professional bodies or communities of practice where you've got the suppliers and the customers. They agree what standard terms of a contract would be. And they'd usually define the duties of the contract, how you get paid, how you manage changes, how you instruct each other, how you submit invoices, all that sort of stuff. The Federation of Master Builders might have a set of contracts.
So it acts as a really good starting point for you to set up that individual contract.
Yes. So a lot of big companies have adopted their own versions, and then quite often we get to have to review them and sign them off. Yeah. And then we need to think out what we're going to pay people, and we need to set out what the supplier selection process is going to be. So in your plan, you'll set out these are the steps that we're going to follow. It can be quite a big document. Yeah. I have seen really large procurement strategies.
Could this be something that we have an example, a template of 4 projects that each project can then take and change the relevant sections to be specific, so you don't have to necessarily start from scratch each time?
Yeah, and usually the procurement department will have a template.
Yeah, and I would imagine when we were talking about contracts, if we've got a legal department within our organisation, they'll probably have something to say about that aspect of it as well.
Yeah, normally the procurement people say, well, this is what we've agreed with legal, and you've just basically got to follow that. And then if you want to amend it, they'll go back and consult the lawyers. I think that's it for a procurement strategy. Okay,
so we talk then, as part of that procurement strategy, we're going to set out the supplier selection process, how we're going to conduct negotiations, award contracts, etc. So talk me through what would be the typical stages in a supplier selection process.
Yeah, I think you can think about a home project where you're fitting a bathroom or a kitchen first before we jump into the more formal process, because they can be quite complicated. But if you're buying something for a home, what do you do first? You research what you want, you write your specifications. So you need to do your requirement specification. Then what you do, you find some local suppliers. So that'd be Googling them. And then you'd send them your spec and say, can I have a price for this? And then they'd come and ask you questions. They'd probably do a visit and ask you questions. And then they'd send you a price or proposal. And then you then review those and decide which person you want to do your new bathroom or kitchen. And it's exactly the same as that, really. In the book, we talk about you do your market research first. There's something called a pre-qualification. You know about this? PPQ. There could be hundreds of suppliers out there, so we're going to get them all to do a pre-qualification questionnaire. Have you done projects like this before? And from there, we'll select maybe 6 that we're going to get to do the full bid.
They sometimes do market consultation exercises as well, because they're particularly one-off projects to see whether this is feasible for the market, if they'd be interested in it, and potentially to start identifying some of those suppliers.
I was told that anyone you put on the pre-qualification list, you should be confident they have the skills and capacity and capability to do the work. And then the next stage is you list your formal invitation to tender, or there's various versions. It's called request for proposal. It can be called different things. Basically, that's you send out all the pack of information, and usually you give them several weeks or several months even to respond to that invitation to tender, and they might ask you questions during that time. You have to track all the questions. Usually a rule, that all the questions are sent out to all the bidders after a certain date. And then you receive all the bids in, and then you need to evaluate them. So usually they split the evaluation into quality evaluation and cost evaluation.
There's quite a lot of social value and ESG requirements coming into tenders as well. So there's a number of different sections that you've got to hit, and then there's weighting of how many marks they're going to give you across each of those sections.
So in the quality bit, they'll ask you a load of questions, and you have to answer the questions. Then all the questions get scored. And then the same with the cost. Usually they're done separately. So you have a quality assessment team and a cost assessment team. And then they usually combine them in some big equation to find the most economically advantageous bid. So they'll rank all the bids. And then there might be an interview stage that follows on from that, and that'd be scored again against various questions. And then if it's a public procurement contract, the organisation that gets the highest score sure to get the contract. There's usually an option for appeals as well. So if you disagree with the award, you can appeal it.
That's the standstill period, isn't it, at the end, where they've made a decision, but so that everything is really transparent and fair and open. If you're not happy with that, then you've got an opportunity to appeal it before they make their final award.
And then usually there's a bit of negotiation about the fine detail of the contract, the legal contract we talked about earlier. Then eventually you'll sign the contract. And it's then about managing that contract, so making sure that they actually deliver the work to the schedule and budget that you've agreed.
That's the end-to-end supplier selection process. That could take some time. So how do we plan that into our project timelines?
A lot of projects I've worked on, they have procurement as a phase. It wouldn't quite fit the APM life cycle, because usually you start procurement during what the APM called definition. But you can't complete it until your business case and PMP have been signed off at the end, because you can't sign the contracts. But you really want to get the prices back to inform your business case. It straggles that gate within the APM's life cycle.
It feeds into so many things. Like you said, without knowing the costs, you can't complete your business case. Without knowing whether the project and your requirements are feasible within timelines, etc. You can't do that aspect of it.
Quite often you'll see another gate that organisations have just before the contracts are signed. So a pre-contract approval gate. Because that's a big decision, and that usually has to go back to the steering group. So that's quite a common thing to see in in-house life cycles.
So we've selected our supplier, and you mentioned that there might be some negotiation that goes on. The APM PMQ syllabus talks about different negotiation techniques, and we've got some acronyms here. We've got ZOPA, BATNA and Win Win. What are these all about? What does ZOPA mean?
ZOPA. We use an example of buying a car, buying a house. So let's take a cheap house. Say I'm the seller and I'd like to sell my house for £130,000. I'm prepared to accept 110. You're the buyer. You're prepared to go up to £120,000. That's the maximum you can borrow. but you really only want to spend £100,000. So your maximum is 120 and my minimum is 110.
Yeah.
So that's an area where we potentially negotiate somewhere between 110 and 120. Maximum you can borrow and the minimum I'm prepared to accept. That means there's a zone for potential agreement. So there is potential that I could sell you my house.
We've got that overlap in our expectations, I guess.
Yeah. But if it was the other way around, say you were selling me some services and you wanted £150,000 minimum, and I've only got £120,000 maximum, we have no way of meeting that agreement.
Yeah.
So we need to recognise that there is no zone of potential agreement. This deal's not going to happen.
Okay.
So that's ZOPA.
What about BATNA? What does that mean?
BATNA is best alternative to a negotiated agreement. Let's go back to the house example. So I might be buying your house and I might think that I could spend up to 120,000. But if there was another house down the road which was very similar and I could get that one for 115,000, why would I spend 120,000 on your house? So when we go into a negotiation, we should also have a backup, a fallback plan.
Yeah.
It says, okay, if I can't do the deal with Ruth, I'll go and buy Jim's house down the road. Yeah. Psychologically, it puts you in a much stronger position if you walk into negotiation knowing that, okay, I could buy this service off you, but actually I've got another supplier who I'm more than happy to deal with. My best alternative, if you can't meet my price expectations, is I move to this other supplier.
So that confidence that you can actually walk away from this negotiation because you do have another alternative. It's not this or nothing.
Yeah, that's right. And it's not always money. It might be delivery time.
And then the final one is win-win.
I think this is really misunderstood. If you think about Thomas Kilman's model.
Yeah.
Remember, we had compromise where neither party gets what they want. That's a bit of a lose-lose because neither party is getting exactly what they want. There's a real good book called Get Into Yes. They're the people who invented ZOPA, BATNA and Win Win.
Okay.
If you read that book, they talk about win-win. It's that solution that gives both parties what they want without compromise. So win-win isn't you give a little bit and I give a little bit.
Yeah.
Win-win is we find a solution that's much more cost effective, but also gives everybody technically what they want.
Yeah.
So it meets the requirements. So building houses in a factory, sending them to site so they just go on off a lorry. It's cheaper. It's more environmentally friendly. There's less waste. It's easier for the builder.
Yes.
It's a win-win.
But the buyer still gets a lovely new property to live in.
Which is probably cheaper, better insulated. But to achieve that win-win, you have to change your paradigm.
If we go back to the procurement strategy, I've often responded to tenders where they've pre-solutionized, but have also got another option of, if you've got a better idea about how you can meet these requirements, please tell us what that might be. It could be a completely different angle on things. Is that something that could help us get to that win-win?
Yeah, you've opened up a big area of debate there, Ruth. So it's back to outcome versus output, isn't it?
Yeah.
A key thing to decide in your procurement strategy is, are you buying the outcome or are you buying the output? Are you just specifying I want A, B, C, D, F, and G? Or are you saying, well, I want something that's going to make my customer engagement better? So to do with a win-win, from my paradigm, you have to be focused on the outcome.
Not the output.
A different output may achieve a better outcome.
Okay, so that's all about the supplier selection process and negotiations. Now let's turn our attention to contractual relationships and reimbursement. We've appointed our supplier, we've gone through the negotiations. There are different types of contractual relationships that we can put in place, aren't there? I think you've alluded to some of these. Talk a little bit more about that.
So that is whether you select a sole supplier. The APM call it a single supplier. I struggle with this a little bit, actually. In their mindset, a single supplier is you go to one supplier and they do everything. And that happens in some cases, like our web developer. That's one form of contractual relationship they talk about. The other type, which is more common, is where you go to a prime or principal contractor and they subcontract it all out to separate people. You usually pay premium to a prime contractor to manage those subcontractors. And they usually carry the risk of the interfaces between the different subcontractors. So they usually do the project management, the planning and the scheduling and all that sort of stuff. The other option is where you employ different contractors individually and separately. So this is like parallel contracts, but you've got to manage the interfaces. So you've got to make sure that the plumber is finished so that the tiler can come in. And the final one they talk about is sequential contracts, where You might give the whole project to one organisation, then at the end of a phase, move it on to another organisation. So that's often where you get an architect to do all the design work, and then you take that design and you put that in your invitation to tender, and you get a builder to bid for the construction phase, but you have to manage the interface between the architect and the builder. You're stuck in the middle. Again, it's about the risk, how much risk you want to take, where you think that risk best sits. Does that best sit with you as the client? How should we break down the contracts into the different risk areas?
So we've got our contractual relationships. We need to pay our suppliers now. There are different methods of supplier reimbursement, and the syllabus says that we need to know what those are and when it's appropriate to use them. So they mention fixed price, cost plus fee, per unit quantity and target cost. Let's go through each one of them in turn. Let's start with fixed price then.
So this is quite clear, isn't it? Fixed price is usually when you've got a really well-known specification and the contractor can provide a fixed price for a fixed scope of work. So you have to know what your scope of work is.
Okay.
So when would you use it? When you've got a clearly defined scope of work. So on a linear life cycle, for instance, be most effective because you've got that detailed requirement specification, output-based delivery.
And the supplier feels confident and able to quote that fixed price. So the next one then is cost plus fee.
This is where you pay the supplier's costs. So usually it involves some form of open book arrangement where you can see all their costs. You need to see the salaries of the people they employ and all that sort of stuff. So it's quite high transparency. You'll see their timesheets and expenses, and then you agree a profit margin on top. That can be like a percentage. So you can say, I'll pay you 5% profit margin. So send us all your timesheets, your invoices, and everything else, and I'll pay you 5% profit on top of that cost. Or it can be a fixed fee. So I could say it's £1 million contract and I'll pay you £100,000 of profit.
Yeah, okay.
So I'll pay all your costs, but the fee, the profit that I'll pay you is fixed. As the scope goes up, you don't get any more money.
So when's it appropriate to use that? You mentioned that there's a high degree of transparency that's required between the supplier and the customer. When would you use that method?
You'd use that on iterative life cycles, because if you think about an iterative life cycle, what you're buying, you're not buying a fixed scope. What you're buying is 5 developers in a bunker for 5 weeks. So you're basically buying cost plus a fee. You're just basically buying a day rate, aren't you?
And that outcome more than a specific defined output.
Yeah, and they're also used in R&D projects and things like that where there's high levels of uncertainty and risk, or often at the front end conceptual phase, so concept studies.
That makes sense. Next one then is per unit quantity. What's that one about, and when is it appropriate to use that?
Per unit quantity is usually where you're paying an agreed price for each unit. So travel and subsistence is the most common example people know about. So if you drive a car on your client's business, you charge them 45p a mile.
Yeah.
So it's an agreed unit rate. If you pour a cubic metre of concrete, you pay this much per cubic metre of concrete. Yeah. Usually the quantity is measured afterwards. So they're called remeasure contracts.
Okay.
But there's sort of like industry standard rates quite often for the unit.
Our final one then is target cost.
What we do here is set a target price at £1 million, and I'm waving my arms in the air, which no one will see on the podcast. So you set a target of £1 million, and then you have a pain share, gain share mechanism. So if we overspend the target, say we go over to 1.2 million, then I will pay you 1.1 million. So I have £100,000 of pain and you have £100,000 of pain. So we share that. If you manage to deliver the project cheaper at £800,000, for instance, then I would pay you £900,000. So I save £100,000 and you get £100,000 bonus.
Yeah.
So we share the pain and share the gain. When would we use them? You need a really good way of setting the target. So again, where you've got really well-defined scope. Someone told me once that warehouses, these big tin warehouses, they use them on there and they're really effective because it's really easy to estimate parametrically the cost of building a warehouse is. They're all the same. So there's lots of ways that you can save money from economies of scale, especially if you've got like a big industrial estate with lots of them on. So by ordering the materials at the right time, it's a really well-defined scope. It works well.
I guess it won't work that well if it's not realistic that the supplier could get that reward section of it. If this is what they're likely to spend, they're not going to be likely to make those economies of scales and efficiencies. Then you're not really motivating them to achieve that.
Well, if you were bidding for a target price contract and you were a bit vague about what the cost was going to be, what would you do?
I'd probably be a bit higher, put the prices up.
Exactly. But if you were bidding for a target price contract and there was a well-known industry parametric model that told you what the price was going to be, you'd bid at that price and find efficiencies.
And then find those efficiencies.
I have worked on target price contracts, and the incentive is to overinflate the target. And then that creates really bad blood because you as a client go, well, I've been done here.
Looking at all of those different methods, there are circumstances where it's more appropriate to use them, but there are also pros and cons to using different types of reimbursement method.
So you would use them where there's an opportunity to collaboratively work together to reduce the cost. I don't know whether do you think you'd use them for iterative life cycles? That would be interesting, wouldn't it? Target price.
Would be.
To deliver this performance specification and the target is £1 million. If you have more iterations than planned, then we share the pain. Interesting.
Because the cost should be fixed and defined, potentially you've got the opportunity to deliver more scope if you're coming in below that price.
Yeah.
I know it's an interesting one to think about.
I've never really got anybody who could explain to me how you do procurement of large competitive procurement of iterative projects. I think it's mostly used for in-house teams.
Or where, as you said, that's more per unit quantity is used, and you bring the supplier resources into your team, and they essentially are part and parcel of your team, managed as part and parcel of your team, but the costing and the reimbursement is done via a contract.
If I was a software developer, I'd much rather work on an iterative life cycle commercially than a fixed price, because I could just keep adding iterations and I'd be a cost plus effectively, wouldn't it? I think that's one of the big downsides of iterative life cycles is the cost plus nature of the contracts.
I'd agree with that. I think we've covered all of the learning objectives, Paul. We started off by thinking about the purpose and importance of procurement strategies, and we looked at the typical contents for such a strategy. Then we looked at what might be the stages if you were going to select a supplier, and how you'd plan that into your project and how you'd conduct negotiations. And then we've had a look at, once you've identified your supplier, what kind of contractual relationships there could be, and also different methods for supplier reimbursement. We've had a really good look at procurement, and that's been some really interesting discussion.
Great. Good. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much.
Speak to you soon.